So now to think about the performance as a whole. And remember that that is when the examiner turns to a different set of criteria, which address communication, interpretation, and delivery. And in a way, we're stepping back from the individuality of the unfolding program. It's finished now, we've heard all the playing, and we're thinking about the entirety of the performance as a whole, thinking about the program from first note to last note. And the first area of consideration is this one of communication. And I think the implicit question is, how well did the performance come across? How vivid was the musical communication? Well, and the answer is that the communication was positive. It was reliable, it was consistent, there was a sense of clear engagement with the music and thereby also with the listener. But there was certainly room for that to be more demonstrative, as if kind of to an audience. I know it's a challenge because you need the music stands and you need the copy in order to read music, but at times it did feel as though the playing was a little bit introvert, a bit private, and the stand was part of that, rather than being outwardly directed and sort of shared with the listener. And I think there's scope for development in terms of the outward direction of the performance, the element of bringing it across, putting it across clearly. There's another aspect to the communication side, which is, we call it the sort of sequence and the pacing of the program. So that's to do with the order of the pieces, how well that works. We're now, as I said, stepping back, thinking about the entirety, but it's also to do with how well did one piece lead to a next, how well were the transitions managed. And the answer to that question, I would say, is well. There was a good sense of space and room and frame between each of the pieces. There wasn't any sense of kind of rushing or lack of space or poise between them. That was well controlled. I'm thinking about the sequence, in other words, the order, the running order. How effective was that? And we always say, as examiners in this area, we're not assessing the program in and of itself. Those pieces, that's a program. There's no quibble with that. But what about the order? So we started with a solo piece, then an accompanied piece, then another accompanied piece, and then an unaccompanied study style piece at the end. That choice of sequence meant that the most significant technical challenges occurred in the program at a time when the challenges on stamina and physical resources, mental focus, were at their greatest, because you get tired. It's tiring playing an instrument like the flute and lots of others. So I wondered whether the musical outcome of that, because as I mentioned when I talked about that piece, the technical side of that piece was definitely challenging. That was partly to do with where it came in the program, perhaps. And just thinking about sequence, I think that's a good example of where it may be that putting the most technically demanding piece, or certainly with the most florid and fast-moving notes, which were a challenge, putting that elsewhere might have led to a different musical outcome. It's not for sure, but it's a thought. So I would have said, in terms of the sequence of the program, we had some reservations perhaps about that as well, in terms of how effective it turned out to be. Thinking about interpretation, musical interpretation, that's about bringing out the intrinsic musical character and the stylistic characteristics of each piece. And we started with a 20th century character piece by Alan Bullard. Then it was the scherzo, the Melbonis piece. Then there was a Bach concerto movement, and finishing again with a solo piece. So plenty of variety to be realized. But I think my main point to say is that I think all of the stylistic characteristics of those pieces could be more vividly portrayed. There was a sense of contrast, there was a sense of awareness and engagement with the different musical characters and roles in those pieces, but each of them could be more distinctive. I talked about that when I was referring to each piece, but that lies in realizing the articulation, the dynamic detail, bringing out the phrasing, and making the music sort of come alive in terms of its intrinsic qualities and character. That said, there was really good ensemble awareness. That's another thing we take into account. Do you understand? Do you interpret your role when, especially there's an accompaniment, but not only, do you interpret your role with understanding and insight? And I think we can say yes to that. There was a good sense of connection and interplay with the accompaniment. And awareness of the roles that were being played. Let's think about delivery. That's you and your instrument. How well is the delivery through the instrument? And I think if I were to highlight one area where perhaps our reservations are more, it would be in this area, because in each of the pieces, in all four, there were aspects of delivery of the notes where not everything was crisp and clear and truly secure, particularly at speed. And it's interesting thinking about program choice again. Each of these pieces was fast. They all called for technical facility, fluency, agility, and a lot of flexibility in the finger work. And there were times in each of the pieces where that came a little bit unstuck, and we didn't hear necessarily every single one of the fast-moving notes, a little bit of glossing over, some scrambling and unevenness, those sort of things. Now, that didn't undermine the success of any of the pieces, but if we step back as we're doing for performance as a whole, look at it through the panoramic lens, that was kind of thematic. That was recurrent through each of the pieces in the program. And so under the heading of delivery, this business about the fast moving notes and challenges to the finger work, intonation was an issue too. In the third piece, the flute had got progressively sharper through the program. And in terms of instrument management, there was an opportunity to recheck the tuning, perhaps after the second piece with the piano, or even before starting to play with the piano. And of course, that is part of instrumental delivery, managing the instrument, managing the aspects. They're quite straightforward, but they're easy to overlook. And of course, in the unaccompanied pieces, that's not going to show in the same way as it did with the accompanied pieces. So in terms of delivery, perhaps that was less in balance of strength than some of the other areas. And if we roll all of that together and think about communication, interpretation, delivery across the whole program, that mark out of 30 is going to land in the pass area. So thinking about the overall result for that exam, I think I've pointed to quite a few merit qualities and strengths, commendations that we can say about the playing, but also a balance on the other side of reservations that we might have, and I've pointed those out. But what I wanted to say about the overall result of that grade 7 flute exam is that it would come out as a pass overall result.